Ohalecha Yaakov, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael, Ma tovu. Ohalecha Yaakov, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael, V'ani berov chastecha avovetecha eshtachaveh el hichal kodecha b'yiratecha ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael.
Shabbat Shalom. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Temple Israel. Last week, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur has a special name, Shabbat Shuvah. This week, the Shabbat between Yom Kippur and Sukkot also has a special name. It's called Shabbat I'm Tired. Thank you. Appreciate that. I'll be here all day. Welcome back to Temple Israel. It's good to have you in person. It's good to have you joining us over StreamSpot. We begin the Shacharit, the morning service, on page 147, the second paragraph. Shochenad marom v'kadosh shemo. בפי ישרים תתהלל, ובדברי צדיקים תתברך, ובלשון חסידים תתרומם, ובקרב קדושים תתקדש, ובמקלות רבבות עמך בית ישראל. מי נשמך מקים לכל דור ודור שכן כל פק ליתנו לבנך בנילה. להודות, להלל, לשבח, לפאר, לרומם, להדר, לברך, להלל ולקלס, על כל דברי שירות ותשבחות, דוד בן ישי, עבדך משיחך. Page 148, please rise. ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו על המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ובארץ. כי לך נערנו אלוהינו ששפך עליו זמרת מלך. ברכות והודאות מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני אל מלך גדול גדול בתשבחות אל ההודאות אדון הנפלאות אדון הנפלאות הבוחר בשירי זמרה מלך מלכי העולמים יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה ויעמד דברי קרותי וימליך מלכותי בחיי חונו ויומי חונו בחיי דכל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולמי יומיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו לעילא מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן ויעלמה ויאמרו amen. Bottom of page 149. ברכו את אדוני המבורך. ברוך אדוני המבורך המבורך לעולם ועד. may be seated, page 150. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei et hakol, hakol yoducha v'kol yishabechucha. Efes piltecha, go aleinu limor hamashiach, v'yendo melech hamoshienu, litchiyat hametim. Page 151, El Adon. El Adon al kol amasim baruch umvorach befi kol neshama godlo v'tuvo male olam da'at utfuna aso v'vimoto hamid ka'eh al chayot hakodesh v'nedar bechavod al hamerkava zechut umishor lifnei chiso chesed v'rachamim lifnei chevodo Tovim meorot shebara Eloheinu yitzaram beda'at bevina ufaskel koach ugvura natan bahem liod moshtim bekerev tevel meleim ziv umfikim noga na'ezivam bechol ha'olam semechim betzeitam v'sasim bevoam osim b'yem aretzon konam Pe'er v'chavod notnim lishmot zahala v'rina lezecher malchuto kara l'shemesh v'yizrach hora'a v'hitkin surat halvana shevach notnim lo kol seva marom tiferet ugedula serafim v'ofanim v'chayot hakodesh La'el asher Shabbat mikol hamasihim.
We're on page 152.
Titbarach Moshienu al shevach masei yadecha v'yal meorei or she'asita yifarucha sela.
Top of 153.
Titbarach tzureinu malkeinu v'go aleinu borei kedoshim. Titbarach tzureinu malkeinu v'go aleinu borei kedoshim. Kulam ahuvim, kulam berurim, kulam giborim, v'kulam osim b'yema'u yera, retzon konam, v'kulam potchim et pihem, b'kdusha u'b'tohara, b'shira u'b'zimra, u'varachim u'meshavachim mefarim, maritzim u'maktishim, mamlichim et shem, ala melech hagdol hagibor banara kadoshu. Laktish leyotzram v'nachad ruach b'safa v'rurav nima kedosha kulam ki'echad onim v'yomerim be'yira kadosh 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 Adonai tzvaot meloch kol haaretz kevodo Yofanim v'chayot hakodesh berash gadol minasim leumat serafim leumatam mishabechim v'yomerim Baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo le'el baruch nimo yiteinu l'melech hachai v'kem smi al gvar asach l'shopam mechamot Hamchadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid maseh bereshit kamor leoserim gedolim ki leolam chasto or chadashim shal Zion ta'ir v'nizkechu lanu me'era leoro Baruch atah Adonai Yotzer hamiorot. Ahava Rabbah.
Page 154. We gather the four corners of our tzitzit in preparation for the Shema.
והערננו בתורתך ודבק ליבנו במצוותיך ויחל לבבינו לאהבה וליראה את שמך ולא נבוש לעולם ועד ולא נבוש לעולם ועד כי בשם קודשך הגדול והנורא בטחנו נגילה ונשמחה בישועתך והביאנו לשלום. כי אל פועל ישועות אתה ובנו בחרת מכל עם ולשון וקרבתנו לשמך הגדול סלע באמת להודות לך ויחדך באהבה ברוך אתה אדוני הבוחר בעמו ישראל באהבה שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לעוד על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך.
We continue individually, 156.
Adonai Elohechem Emet. ויציב נכון וקיים ישר ולמנח אביך. לדור ודור קיים ושמו קיים וכיסו נכון מלכותו ואמונתו לעד קיימת ודבריו חיים וקיים עולמי עולמים עליו שם עלינו. אמת שאתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו מלכנו מלך אבותינו גואלנו גואל אבותינו יוצאנו צור ישועתנו פודנו מצילנו מעולם שמך אין אלוהים זולתך עזרת אבותינו אתה הוא מעולם מגנו משה לבנה מגמל דור ודור משבח משה אשרי איש שישמע למצוותך Lucky for the river, amen. Adach elana melech Mashiach Mitzrayim gal. Motzi asirim ufodei anavim ve'ozer dalim v'yoneh li'amo b'yeit shavam elav tehilo le'elyon baruch hu u'mevorach Moshe u'Miriam u'bnei Yisrael lecha anu shira b'simcha rabba v'amru
Please rise, page 158, Mi Chamocha.
Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora tehilot, hosef eleh. Shira chadasha shibchu geulim leshimecha al sefat hayam, yachad kulam hodu vehimlichu v'yameru. Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed. Sor Yisrael, kuma v'ezrat Yisrael, uftechinu mecha Yehuda v'Yisrael. Ko aleinu Adonai tzvaot shemo, Kedosh Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael.
Amen. We join the rabbi for the Amidah on page 159.
Nice, but I kach v'yachid tefillah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora El Elyon Komel chasadim tovim v'konei hakol v'zocher chastei avot umevi goel livnei v'neihem leman shemo bi'ahava melech ozer ufoked umoshia umagen Baruch atah Adonai magen Avraham ufoked Sarah atah gibor leolam Adonai mechayem etim atarav lehoshia mechalkel chayim bechesed mechayem etim berachamim rabim tzomech noflim verofeh cholim umatir asurim umekayem emunato lishenei afar michamocha bal gevurot umido melach melech memit umechayei umatzmiach Yeshua v'nemanata leachayod meitim Baruch atah Adonai mechayei ametim. Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam, keshem shmakdishim oto bishmei marom. Katuv al yad neviecha, v'karaz el zeh ve'amar. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Melech kol haaretz kevodo, az bekor ashkadol, adir v'chazak, mashmim kol, minasim l'umat serafim, l'umatam baruch yomeiru, baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. ממקומך מלכנו תופיע ותמלוך עלינו כי מחכים אנחנו לך מתי תמלוך בציון בקרוב בימינו לעולם ועד תשכון תתגדל ותתקדש בתוך ירושלים עירך לדור ודור ולנצח נצח עמי ועינינו תראנה מלכותך כדבר האמור בשירי עוזך על ידי דוד משיח צדקך. ימלוך אדוני לעולם אלוהיך ציון לדור ודור הללויה לדור ודור נגיד גודלך ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לעולם ועד כי אל מלך גדול וקדוש אתה ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
We continue with our silent meditations, the words in the Siddur or the words in our hearts.
We conclude the Amidah, bottom of page 166. Ose shalom, shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom. Ose shalom, shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom. Hu yaseh shalom. Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael Ve'imeru Amen. Ose Shalom Shalom Bimromav Hu Yaseh Shalom.
We continue with Kaddish Shalem 167.
Yitkaral v'yitkara shemei Rabba
Amen.
V'yalma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayachon v'yachon v'chayachon beit Yisrael V'agala v'zman kari v'yimmeru Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevorach Le'olam olam me'omaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitramam v'yitnasei v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalash me'rekudesha Brichu le'elam min kol berachata v'shirata tushbach ravnechem ata damiran b'yalma v'yimmeru Amen. Titkabal sloton v'oton l'chol Yisrael karama v'ondi v'shmaya v'yimmeru Amen. Yesh lamar rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimmeru Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'yimmeru
Amen.
You know, I always find it takes me a few days to get into saying la'ela, la'ela, and then I can't get out of it. I keep wanting to put it in there.
I have the same problem. Yasher Koach, Rabbi, on a wonderful Shacharit service.
We continue with the Torah service, page 168. Please rise.
Ein kamocha va'elohim Adonai v'ein kemasecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim u'memshaltecha b'chol dor v'ador Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed Adonai oz le'amo yitin Adonai yevarech et amo v'shalom Avarachamim heitiva v'yetzonecha et Zion Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim Tivnei chomot Yerushalayim Ibecha levad batachnu Melech el ram v'nisa Adon olamim Vayehi binto Aharon vayomer Moshe Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha ki mitzion tetzei Torah Mitzion tetzei Torah u'devar Adonai miYerushalayim Baruch shenatan Torah Torah Baruch shenatan Torah Torah le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato.
We are the servants of the Holy One, whom we revere, and whose precious Torah we revere at all times. Not on mortals do we rely, nor on angels do we depend, but on the God of heaven, the God of truth, whose Torah is truth, whose prophets are true, and who abounds in deeds of goodness and truth. In God do we put our trust, unto God's holy, precious name do we offer praise. May it be your will that you open our hearts to your Torah, and you fulfill the desires of our hearts and the hearts of all your people Israel, for goodness, for life, and for peace. And let us say, Amen.
Amen. behanarachet velishme kadisha kadisha yakira ana emar tushbechan behanarachet behanarachet velishme kadisha kadisha yakira ana emar tushbechan yer avakadama titiftach libi behoraita v'tashlim mishalin delibi v'liba dechol amach Yisrael letavu lechaim v'lishlam. Amen.
Page 171.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu
Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo. Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Gadol Adonai iti uneromema Shemo yachtav Lecha Adonai hagdula v'hagvura v'hatiferet v'hanetzach v'hahod ki chol b'shamayim u'va'aretz ki chol b'shamayim u'va'aretz Lecha Adonai hamamlacha Ramemu Adonai Eloheinu Ramemu Adonai Eloheinu Ve'ishtachavu leharkocho Ve'ishtachavu leharkocho Ve'ishtachavu leharkocho Ve'ishtachavu leharkocho Ramemu Adonai Eloheinu Ramemu Adonai Eloheinu.
May be seated. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning and Kol HaKavod. Kudos to all of you for coming to Shabbat services this morning. And kudos to everyone joining us on StreamSpot as well. As I said earlier, it's tough to come with all of the shul between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and 8-9 days of Sukkot. It's a lot of shul, so yasher koach to all of you for coming. We turn in our Eitz Chaim Chumash to Parshat Ha'azinu, page 1185, page 1185 in the Chumash. If you're following along in a different book, it is Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 1. And this is actually the very last Torah portion that we read on a regular Shabbat, because the final Torah portion, Vizot HaBracha, next up in the book, is what we chant on Simchat Torah morning, when we conclude the Torah and restart all the way at the beginning from Bereshit. And if you were to look in the Torah scroll, if you were to come up and check it out, Ha'azinu would be a very easy Torah portion to find, because you would notice right away that instead of being written in long lines, it's written in 2 short columns, and it stands out from the rest of the text. And this is because Ha'azinu is what we call in Hebrew a shirah. It could be a song, more likely it's a poem. And it was described at the end of last week's Torah portion of Vayelech. Moses, in his final address to the people, has spent the last many parshiot laying out the terms of the covenant, giving them many of the laws that they will follow, and also warning them about the consequences of following or not following the commandments. Well, in his last address, he switches from the Torah switches from narrative to poetry, and he gives them this poem that he recites to them according to tradition, on the last day of his life, and it's supposed to summarize their relationship with God. There is no mention of the covenant or of specific laws, but rather this parsha, Ha'azinu, talks about the relationship that God builds with Israel over time. And the poetic Hebrew is a little bit tricky to understand. It's also a little bit difficult to chant. It's laid out like a poem with a lot of parallelism between sentences, and sentences that each have two parts that coordinate with each other, which is why it's in two columns. But the themes that it lays out are very familiar to us. If we go through the poetry, we start off with Israel, us. Before we entered into this relationship with God, we're depicted as unworthy, as foolish, as cruel. But nevertheless, God takes us from the desert, we assume to be the desert of Sinai or the desert of Egypt, it's not entirely clear, and brings us to this rich land where we get to enjoy the finest things of life. God raises us up. But then again, despite everything that God does for us, Israel chooses to leave the right path. They follow their eyes to the worship of other gods, and they turn astray. Again, no mention of commandments, but a general feeling of abandoning God, of not showing gratitude. And God responds by punishing the Israelites with exile and with all sorts of defeat and terrible punishments. And it rehashes the contents of the Tochecha, of the rebuke that we read a few weeks ago. But it doesn't leave us on this sad note. It concludes with God taking us back lovingly, taking back all those who choose to return, and then punishing those who harm God's people. It's actually a very difficult poem to read, both because the Hebrew is challenging and also because the content is not particularly comforting. And scholars have wondered what exactly this poem is. And this is not a traditional reading of the Torah, but it is a scholarly reading of the Torah. That when you have an example of poetry in the Torah, it probably predates the story of the Torah. It predates the rest of the text. It was written, they would theorize, at an earlier occasion, at a time when Israel had suffered a major defeat or some type of setback or exile, and Israel was feeling gloomy, and some poet wrote this as a way of comforting that yes, Israel is suffering right now. There's a reason for this. The world makes sense. This is a divine punishment, which I don't know how many of us would find that very comforting, but it worked for them. But don't worry, God will take you back. God will bring you back to your land, and God is going to punish every one of the people who attacked you. And most years, this Torah portion is chanted on Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it works very well on that Shabbat because it contains many of the themes that we talk about on the high holidays. It talks about the inevitability of doing something wrong. Even as we prepare for a better year, we know that we will make mistakes, that we will miss the mark again. It also brings up the theme of giving second chances. God gives Israel a first and a second chance for no apparent reason. Having nothing to do with Israel's actions, God chooses to take Israel out of the desert and then to return to Israel. And it's meant as encouragement for us, if we read it in light of the high holidays, to think of people in our lives who could use a second chance, could use us being a little bit easier on them. Also encourages us to take ownership of our own second chances, to take advantage of the second chances that we are given. I'd like to focus on one last aspect of this text. When we talk about the narrative portion of the Torah, we're used to referring to God in two different ways. Adonai, spelled Yud-He Vav-He, the four-letter name of God, and Elohim, a generic term for gods. Those are the terms that we are most familiar with. But ha'azinu, like many other poems, doesn't or rarely refers to God directly, but it rather refers to God in metaphors, using concrete terms that we understand to describe something that we ultimately can't, because our God is one in the ancient world who you could not see, who you could not converse with the way you could go and talk to an idol or go and talk to another person. So we need terms that we can relate to understand God. And it starts off, the first metaphor used for God is Hatzor Tamim Pa'alo, the rock. God's deeds are perfect. It depicts a God that is unchanging over time, even as we change, even as we alternate between good and bad, between weak and strong. God is constant. God is a rock that was there before we were born and will be there for millennia after we have left this world. And we actually use this image, the rock, and it's one of the reasons why we leave a little stone when we visit somebody at somebody's grave, somebody in the cemetery. The rock has been there before us and will be there long after we're gone, representing our undying love for someone. But then the text goes on and continues with a number of different metaphors. We see God as a father who is teaching. We actually see God depicted as a mother as well, a mother who gives birth to Israel and a mother who nurses Israel to full strength. Then we have God as a warrior. God is depicted as a knight going to fight Israel's wars for Israel and defending Israel. And these are all metaphors that would have been very comforting to people in the ancient world, metaphors that they would have understood. For us, our metaphors for God are a little bit different, and these don't necessarily work for us. We do talk about God often as Avinu, as our father, or probably as we would translate it today, our parent. But we also look for other ways to understand God, because what hasn't changed since ancient times is it's hard to experience a God that you can't see and that doesn't directly speak back to you. And I remember back when I was studying in JTS, there was a very well-known professor of theology, Rabbi Professor Neil Gilman, who taught at JTS for decades. He was a theologian, and he tried very hard to reclaim ancient ideas in a way that people could relate to today. And one of the assignments that he gave his class every year, this was actually back for undergraduates, was to come up with your own metaphor for God. What physical object around you, or what person, or whatever you see around you, do you use to understand God? And this was the culmination, or one of the assignments of his class. You had to think about what represents God for you. And it might be a father, it might be a mother, it might be a warrior, it might be actually another metaphor that's used here, an eagle taking care of its young. For me, the metaphor that I chose was actually something that used to have a lot more function, but is the kippah clip that I use to attach my kippah to my head. And to me, the kippah represents tradition. I carry it with me wherever I go, whether I'm at home, whether I'm at shul, whether I'm traveling. The kippah is an important part of my life. But the kippah clip, back in when I had more hair, was what held it onto my head. And most of the time, you don't notice the kippah clip. You really actually don't notice the kippah. You live with it, you walk around with it. The only time that you notice the kippah is when it flies off, when wind knocks it off, or when, for some other reason, it comes off. And again, the kippah clip, which attaches to your head, would give a little pull on your hair as it comes off of your head, reminding you that it's falling off. And that was my metaphor, that tradition is part of our lives at all times. We use it more or less. But God is there for me when I feel like I am not being attentive enough. If I'm doing something wrong, God is that reminder, that little pull. So that was my metaphor for God. So as you read Parshat Ha'azinu, I encourage you to think about the same question that Rabbi Gilman challenged all of his students. What is your metaphor for God? Do the metaphors in the traditional text speak to you? Do you understand God as a parent, as a permanent rock, as an eagle, as a warrior? Or do you understand God in a different way? And really, the beautiful thing is, I don't think there are wrong answers to that question, because we each have our own relationship with God. So we start Moses' poem, the final speech of his life, page 1185 in the Chumashim, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 1. Our Torah reader for this whole portion will be Bernie Ackerman, who is celebrating his 57th Bar Mitzvah anniversary, which, if I'm doing the math correctly, means that this year is a milestone year for you.
Correct.
Hope he finally gets it right.
We hope he finally
57
gets it
times.
right. And for the first Aliyah, we call on Rabbi Tracy Clears.
ויעזור ויגן ויושיע לך חוסים בו ונאמר אמן הכל בגדול ניתנו כבוד לתורה תעמוד הרב הלוי במקום כהן ברוך שנתן תורה לעמו ישראל בקדושתו ואתם מביאים באדוני אלוהיכם חיים כולכם היום
ברכו את אדוני וברך
ברוך אדוני ברוך לעולם ועד
ברוך אדוני ברוך לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה
Amen. Hazinu hashamayim ba'adaber avitishma ha'oretz imrei fi. Yarov kamator lichi. Tizal katal imroti kisirihim ale deshe. Vichir vivim ale esev. Ki Shem Adonai ekra havu godel Eloheinu. Hatzur tamim polo. Ki chodorcha mishpat. El emunah v'yein avel sadik v'yashor hu shichet lo bonav mumam dorikei shutaltol hal Adonai tigmalu zot am naval v'lo chacham halo hu avicha kanecha hu asecha v'chonenecha.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה
Amen. Yasher Kochech Rabbi Clears. For the second Aliyah, we call on Barney Weinstock, page 1186, verse 7.
ימון שני
Baruch Adonai Baruch.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam
Adonai Baruch Le'olam Bo'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu es toraso. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Zechor yemot olam binu shnot dor vador shal avicha v'yagedecha zekeinecha v'yamru lach v'hanchel elyon goyim b'hafrido b'nei adam yatzeb gibulot amim l'mispar b'nei Yisrael ki Chelek Adonai amo Yaakov chevel nechaloto Yimsoehu b'eretz midbar v'tohu yolel Yishimon Yisovavenhu Yivon Anehu Yitzrenhu Kishon Eno Kanesher Yoir Kino Al Gazalav Yirachef Yifros Kinafav Yikochehu Yisoehu Al Evroto Adonai Bodad Yanchenu V'yein imo el nechor.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher nasan lanu Torah emes v'chayei olam natav b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah.
Amen. Yasher Koch, Barney. We continue with the third Aliyah, page 1187, Dvarim chapter 32, verse 13. And we call on Len Berkowitz.
ימון שלישי
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
ברוך אדוני ברוך לעולם ועד
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et torto. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Yarkivehu albamate oretz vayichal tenuvot sadoi vayenekehu devash misela v'shemen mechamish sur chamat bakor v'chalev son, im Chalev Korim, Ve'elim b'nei Bashan v'yatudim, im Chalev kilyot chita, v'dam einav tishteh chamer, v'yishman yisurun v'yivot, so manta avita kasita v'yito shelo hai asahu, v'ynabel tzur yeshuoto, yakni uhu bezorim b'toevot, yachisuhu yizbechu, Lashedim, lo Elohai Elohim, lo Yida'um, Chadoshim mikoraba'u, lo sherum avotechem, Sur yiladecha teshi vatishkach, el mechalelecha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam, asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam natah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yashar Koach Len. We continue page 1189, Parim chapter 32, verse 19. We call on Didi Seigler.
Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarah.
Baruch Adonai Baruch le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai hamvarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bacha banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Vayar Adonai vayinat mika'as banav uvnotav vayomer. Asira fonai mehem erev ma acharitam ki dor tapuchot hema bonim lo emun bam. Hain kini uni v'lo el ki asuni b'ablehem va'ani aknien below am v'gol naval achisem ki eish kodcha v'yapi v'tikad at she'ol tachti v'toch al eretz v'vulav v'lachet mostei horim espet olem oraot chitzai achalebam mezei ra'av v'lechume reshev v'keteb miriri v'shem behemat ashalach bam im chamat zochalei afor michutz tishakel cherev michadorim amor gam bachur gam betula yonek im ish seva o marti afehem ashpita me'enosh zichram lulei Kaso yev agur peninachrut sorema penyomru yodenu rama below Adonai poal kosod ki goy avad eitzod hema v'ein bahem tivuna.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam natah b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Didi Asher Kochech. Didi, I heard a teaching taught over in your name. We're always supposed to quote someone when we say. Someone told me that you teach that before a fast day, it's good to eat red meat.
Oh, yes.
Is that a true thing?
Yeah,
That's
we
your-
started that maybe about 25 or 30 years ago because the red meat breaks down slower, and it was always a better fast than having, say, chicken.
There we go. Well, I heard that as I was starting Yom Kippur this week, and I regretted having salmon before the fast. We continue on page 1190, Devarim chapter 32, verse 29. We call on Dr. Linda Rushvarg, Cantor Elias Rushvarg, and Aaron Rushvarg.
Yamdu Chamishi Liot.
Yeah.
Kulat Adonai Hamboach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Leolam Vaed.
Baruch Adonai Hamboach Leolam Vaed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bacha banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Lu achmu yashki lu zod yovinu liacharitam echa yirdof echad elef ushnayim yonisu ribava im lo kitsuram echoram vadanoi hiskiram Ki lochi tzureinu tzuram v'yovenu palilim. Ki migef and sedam gafnam umishad mod amora anovema in veirosh ashkelot mirorot lamo chamat taninim yenam v'rosh pitonim akzor halohu kamus imodi chotum biotrotoi li nakam v'shilem Li'et Talmud Raglam Ki Korov Yom Adam V'chosh Atidot Lamo Ki Yodin Adonai Amo V'yal Avodav Yitnachem Ki Yireh Ki Oz La Yod V'efes Otsur V'yozuv V'yomar Elohema Sur Chasa Yuvo Asher Cheleb Zebochem Zebachemu Yachelu Yishtu Yenisicham Yakumu Vyazruchem Yihi Alechem Sitra Ru'ata Ki Ani Hu V'ein Elohim Imodi Ani Omit V'achaye Mochatzti Bani Erpa V'ein Miyodi Matzi V'ein Miyodi Matzi
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tocheinu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yasher kochachem rushvargs.
Thank you, Baruch.
We continue on page 1192, Dvarim chapter 32, verse 40. Call on Patty Norcom.
Tamod Shishi.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach.
Baruch
Adonai Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamvarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bacha banu mechol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Ki esa el shamayim yodi v'yomar tichai anochi le'olam im shanati birak harbi v'tochaz b'mishpat yodi ashiv nakam l'tzoroi v'lim sanai ashalem ashkir chitzai midam v'charbi tochal v'asor midam halal v'shivya merosh parot oyev Aninu goyim amo kidam avodav yikam v'nakam yoshiv l'tzorov v'chiper admoto amo.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yasher kochech Patty. Before we go on to the next aliyah, if everyone could take out the Sidurim and turn to page 446 in the Sidurim. And I talked at the opening of the Torah portion how this Parsha, Ha'azinu, was probably meant as a comfort to Jews going through a difficult time period in its initial form. I also commented that I think many of us would find it difficult to use this portion as being particularly comforting. It's the theology that is difficult for us to stomach, let's put it that way. But I find it fascinating that Jews have used this section in their dark times. And the last verse in the Aliyah that we just read says, Harninu goyim amo kidam abadav yikom and akam yashiv letzara v'chiper admato amo. O nations, acclaim God's people, for God will avenge the blood of his servants, wreak vengeance on God's foes, and cleanse the land of his people. And very hard verse to read, not exactly a beautiful verse, even though it's in poetic language, but that's a verse that's very familiar to Jews in traditional synagogues, because since the Middle Ages, this verse was used in one of the prayers called Av HaRachamim, that it's in the back of our book. Occasionally we might put it in, but in older Sidurim, or more traditional congregations, this prayer was a memorial prayer, kind of like Yizkor, that was chanted every single Shabbat, and it was written by Jews commemorating the destruction of a number of Jewish communities in Germany to pogroms. And they quote this verse. They quote a verse from Torah, a verse from Navi, from the prophets, and a verse from Ketuvim, from the writings. And from Torah, they chant this verse, promising divine vengeance on the people who had destroyed their communities. And they said, well, while we don't recite this every Shabbat, I find it very meaningful to see that for centuries Jews did turn to this Torah portion for comfort in their difficult times, and they used it to look forward to a better future, and as a way to express their anger at what was happening to them. We continue with the Torah reading back in the Chumash, page 1193, verse 44. We call on Marcy Thaler, and the Torah reading switches from the poetic style back to the narrative and talks about Moses presenting his final instructions, presenting this shirah, this poem to the Israelites, and instructing them to follow it. And then Moses climbing to the top of Har Avarim and Har Nevo to look out into the land of Israel before he dies. Page 1193, verse 44.
Amod Shvi'i. Baruchu et Adonai Hamborach.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Vayavo Moshe vaydaber. Ekol divrei hashiro hazot beoznei ha'am hu v'Hoshea binun vayichal Moshe ledaber. Ekol hadurim ha'ele el kol Yisrael vayomer aleichem simu levavechem lechol hadurim asher anochi made bachem hayom asher titzavum et b'neichem lishmor lasot et kol divrei haTorah hazot ki lo davor reiku mikem ki hu chayechem uvadavor hazeh tarichu yamim al ho'adama asher atem ovrim et hayarden shama l'rishta v'daber Adonai el Moshe b'yetzem yom hazeh le'mor alei el har ho'avarim hazeh har nevo asher b'eretz Moab asher el pnei Yerecho Orei et eretz Canaan asher adi noten libnei Yisrael li'achuzah umut bahar asher ata ola shama v'heyosef el amecha kasher meit acharon ochicha bechor achor v'yeyosef el amav al asher me'altem bi b'toch b'nei Yisrael b'mei mirivat kadesh midbar tzin al asher lo kidashtem oti b'toch b'nei Yisrael ki mineged tireh et ha'oretz v'shama lo tavo el ha'oretz asher adi noten libnei Yisrael.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Asher kochech Marcy. Take a moment to pray on behalf of those who are ill, those in need of physical and spiritual well-being. Included in our prayers today, we think of Chana Miriam bat Rivka, Rav Yaakov Chai ben Hadassah, Shimon ben Yaakov Mordechai ben Naomi, Devorah bat Sarah, Hershel Yehoshua ben Malka, Perel bat Rezel, Dov ben Ita, Shmuel Yaakov ben Kalia ve'Ari, Devorah Rachel, Malka bat Sarah, Leib Yisrael ben Sipora, Aliza Meira bat Leah, Tzivya bat Chana, Yudit bat Miriam, Fegla bat Chasha, Arya ben Malka, Kalman Pinchas ben Moshe ve'Eta, Sarah bat Chaim Shlomo, Sarah bat Chaya, Chanoch Yitzchak ben Sarah, Sarah bat Shendel, Binyamin Noah, Aver Yitzchak, Yosef ben Miriam, Miriam Tzivya bat Aaron betova, Raphael ben Perel, Chaim Yitzchak ben Gittel Fegel, Leah bat Ruth, Dawson Julia, Elijah Avila, Jordana Faith Ram, Mabel Tannenbaum, Kathy Berlin, Don Roth, Philip LaMancha, Tamra Rivera, Irene Janet Locker, Linda Castellanos, Thomas Clark, David Shmuel ben Chaim Beryl, Miriam Daniela bat Areli Vimoshe, Phyllis Keller, Marsha Bracha bat Doba, Joanne Cameron, Linda Bain Clark, Thomas Clark, Shirley Noble, Chana Shifra bat Moshe Vibluma, Reuben ben Shmuel, and Carol Spiesman. If you're praying for someone today, I invite you to please rise in your place. Recite the name when I turn to you. Kol HaCholim, and all those who are ill. Cantor leads us in the Mishaberach.
Mishaberach avotenu mikor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Mishaberach imotenu mekor habracha leavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen. We thank Bernie Ackerman for his beautiful Torah reading as he leads us in Chati Kadesh. Please rise.
Kada v'yikada shemei rabba.
Amen.
Yomadi brachi v'tevi amlich malchutei
b'chayechon uv yomechon
v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael b'hagola
Ubizman kariv
v'meru.
Amen. Yehi shmei rabba mevorach le'olam le'omaya yiparach.
Yitborach v'yishtabach v'yiparar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yithalev v'yithalal shemei d'kudisha le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata
tushbechata v'nechemata damiran b'yoma v'meru. Amen.
You may be seated. Bernie is not finished yet. We turn to page 1194, Devarim, chapter 32, verse 48. To chant and to have this aliyah, we call on Bernie Ackerman.
Thank you.
Yamod Eliakim Gedalia ben
Nisan ben Sion.
Nisan ben Sion ben Eliam Gedalia Maftir.
Baruch hu et Adonai HaBorach. Baruch Adonai HaBorach le'olam va'ed. Baruch ato Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher b'charbanu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch ato Adonai noten haTorah. V'daber Adonai el Moshe b'etzem hayom hazeh le'mor alei el har ha'avarim hazeh har nevo Asher Ba'oretz Moab, Asher El Panei Yerecho, Urei Eretz Canaan, Asher Ani Notain, Libnei Yisrael Li'achuzah, Umut Bahar, Asher Ata Olah Shama, V'Heosef El Amecha, Kasher Meit, Aharon Ochicha Bechor Hachor, V'Yosef El Amabal, Asher Mi'altem Bi, B'toch B'nei Yisrael, V'Mei Rivat Kadesh Midbar Tzin, Al Asher Lo Kidashtem Oti B'toch B'nei Yisrael, Ki Mineged Tireh Et Ha'oretz, V'shama Lo Tavo El Ha'oretz, Asher Ani Noten Libnei Yisrael. Baruch Ato Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam notah b'tocheinu. Baruch Ato Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Now, Bernie, Asher Koach, we did do this last year, but you actually were on an island somewhere chanting Torah for us. That was memorable. And you had palm trees in the background, although I think that was a virtual background.
That was the real thing.
That was the real deal. You were standing in front of palm trees when you read Torah over Zoom last year. It might have been more comfortable than wearing a suit, but we're happy to have you back and reading from the actual Torah.
I didn't even consider my bathing suit.
You didn't think about it, but decided that was very 2020, not 2021. But remind us, so 57 years ago, where did you celebrate your bar mitzvah?
Where?
It was
I was
very close by.
I was in Dilworth Road, our old Temple Israel. And thinking, I'm telling you yesterday, my dad was 50 and my mother was 43. And it was a special day. I did the whole service. I think I was the only one, I was the first one to read my whole Sedra, and now with the triennial, I may be the only one.
It's true, because we always read the whole Ha'azinu. Is your mom watching today?
I think she is.
Well, we say hello and good Shabbos to Sarah Ackerman, and I'm sure it was a memorable bar mitzvah for her as well. And we're glad that she's still watching you read Torah. All of these years later, we wish you Yasher Koach and many more years of reading Torah and celebrating your bar mitzvah anniversary. Cantor, would you offer Bernie a blessing?
I would love to. Misha Berach Avotin Arba Mitzchak Yaakov Imotinu Sarah Rivka Rachel V'Leah Hu Yivarech Et Nisan Ben Sion Ben Eliyahu Gedalia Your mom? V'Sara Babur Sheba'u Hayom Leodol L'Shem Kodsho Al Kol HaChesed Asher Gamal Lo, thank you. Gamal lo miyom habar mitzvah ad hayom hazeh hakadosh baruch hu yishmerem mikol tzara v'tzuka mikol nega umachala v'yishlach bracha v'yatzacha b'chol ma'aseh yadav kol Yisrael lecha v'nomar amen. Siman tov u'mazel tov u'mazel tov u'siman tov siman tov u'mazel tov u'mazel tov u'siman tov siman tov u'mazel tov u'mazel tov u'siman tov ye'elanu 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 u'lechol Yisrael ye'elanu ye'elanu u'lechol Yisrael ye'elanu ye'elanu u'lechol Yisrael ye'elanu ye'elanu u'lechol Yisrael. Mazel tov.
Bernie, as I always say to bar mitzvah kids, take a breath while we lift and dress the Torah. Your Haftorah is coming. Please rise for Hagba and Galila. We call on Roger Malman to lift the Torah and Team Wolk to dress the Torah.
Yamdu hamagbiya v'hagolilot.
Don't get in his way.
Torah asher sam Moshe lifnei b'nei Yisrael al pi Adonai b'yad Moshe vezot haTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei b'nei Yisrael vezot haTorah asher sam
The Haftarah for Ha'azinu can be found on page 1197 in the Chumashim, coming from the second book of Samuel, chapter 22, verse 1. Bernie actually gets to chant his real Bar Mitzvah Haftarah, which doesn't happen too often because normally this is Shabbat Shuvah. But this is another example of biblical shirah, biblical poetry, this one taken from the end of the life of King David, thanking God for being with him. And like the Torah portion, may be seated, like the Torah portion, King David compares God to a rock, to something that is there constantly, that is unbreakable, and has supported him through the difficulties of his life. Page 1197, 2 Samuel chapter 22.
Before I start, I want to tell you one thing about this Haftorah, and that is when my dad led services for 20 years in Salisbury, North Carolina, and whenever he got to the Shemona Esrei, the silent devotion, he would say, "This is the longest silent devotion, Shemona Esrei, that we do all year." Well, this Haftorah is not the longest Haftorah, or the most number of verses, but it's second to the Song of Deborah. It has 52 verses, and this one has 51 verses. So, a little tidbit of trivia.
There's a joke similar to that. You hear that compliment about a cantor. He's really good at the silent Amida.
There is a cantor. That must be true. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratzav v'divreihem hanemorim be'emet Baruch atah Adonai abocher b'Torah u'Moshe abdo u'Yisrael amo u'Yeho emet v'tzedek V'daber David l'Adonai et divrei hashira hazod b'yam hitzil Adonai oto mikaf koloi vav mikaf sha'ul Vayomar Adonai Sali Sudati Umfalti Li Elohei Tsuri Echeseba Mogini Vekeren Ishi Miskabi Umnusi Moshi Mechamas Toshieni Michulal Ekra Adonai Umeovai Ivoshea Ki Afofuni Mispre Movet Nachale Velial Yavaatuni Evle Sheol Sabuni Kidmuni Mokshe Movet Vatsarli ekra Adonai ve'el Elohai ekra vayishma me'echolo koli v'shavoti bi'oznav v'yikoash v'atir ash ha'oretz Mostot hashomayim yirgazu vayiko ashu ki chora lo ola asham biapo v'esh mipiv tochel kecholim boaru mimenu vayet shomayim vayerad va'arofel tachat raglav vayirkav al kiruv vayav vayera al kanfei ruach vayoshet hoshech sevivotav Sukkot Hashrat Mayim Ovei Shechokim Minoga Negda Boaru Gachalei Eish Yar'aim Min Shamayim Adonai V'Elyon Yitain Kolo Vayishlach Hitzim Vayfitzim Barak vayacham Vayera'u afikei yam yigalu mosdot tevel. Bega'arat Adonai minishmat ruach apo yishlach mimoram yikocheni yam sheni mimayim rabim yatzileni me'ovias misonai Ki yamsu mimeni yikadmuni biyam edi vayihi Adonai mishan li vayotze la merchav oti yichatzeni ki chafetz bi yigmaleni Adonai kitzkati Kivor Yodai Yoshiv Li Ki Shomarti Darchei Adonai V'lo Roshati Me Elohoi Ki Chomishpotav L'negdi V'chukatav Lo Asur Mimena V'echeye Tamim Lo V'eshtamra Me'avoni V'yoshev Adonai Li K'tzikati Kivori L'neged Einav Im Hasid Titchasad Im Gibor Tamim Titamam Im Navar Titavar Im Ikesh Titapa Viet Am Ani Toshia V'einecha Aramim Tashbil Kiata Neri Adonai V'Adonai Yagia Choshka Ki Ticha Arutz Gedud Belohai Adaleg Shur Ha'el Tamim Darka Imrat Adonai Tzirufa Mogen Hu Lecho Achosim Bo Ki Miel Mibaladei Adonai Umitzur Mibaladei Eloheinu Ha'el Ma'uzi Chayil Vayeter Tamim Darki Mishaveh Raglai Bo Ayalad V'Albamatai Ya'amideni Milamed Yodai La Milchama V'Nichat Keshet Nechusha Zirwa Otoi Vatiten Li Morgen Yishecha Va'anotecha Tarbeni Tarchiv Sa'adi Tachteni V'Lo Moadu Karsuloi Erdafa Oivai Voashmidam V'Lo Oshu Ad Balotam Vo'achalein Vo'emosam V'Lo Yikumun Vayipalu Tachat Raglav Vataz Rainy Chayil La Milchama Takriya Kamai Tachteni V'Oi Vai Tatali Oref Mi Misanai V'Atzmitain Yishu V'Ain Moshiach El Adonai V'Lo Onam V'Yeshakem Kafar Oretz Ketit Chutzot Adikem Erkoem Vat Pal Tanteni Merivei Ami, Tishmareni, Lirosh Goyim, Lo Yodati, Ya'avduni, B'nai Nechor, Yitbachashuli, Lishmo Ha'ozen Yishamuli, B'nai Nechor, Yibolu, V'yachgiru, V'miskurotam, Chai Adonai, Uvoruk Suri, V'yorum, Elohei Tzur Yishi, Ha'el, Hanotain Nikomod, Li, Umorid Amim Tachteni, Umotzi Meovoy, Umikomai, Tiro Mameni, Meish Hamosim Tatzileni, Alkain, Odecha Adonai, Bagoyim, Ushimcha Azamer, Migdal, Yeshuot Malka, V'yosech Esed, Limshicha, L'David Uzaro, Adolam, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech olam, Sur kol olamim, Sadik b'chol hadorot, Hoel hane'eman, ha'omer v'yoseh, Hamdaber mikayim, Shekol dvorav emet vot tzedek, Ne'eman atahu Adonai Eloheinu, V'nemonim devorecha, V'davorecha midvorecha, Achor lo yoshuv reikam, Ki el melech ne'eman, V'rachaman ata, Baruch ato Adonai, Hoel hane'eman b'chol devorav,
Amen.
Rachem al Tzion, Ki hi beit chayenu, V'laluvat nefesh toshia, b'mheira v'yomeinu, Baruch ato Adonai, Mesameach Tzion b'vonecha.
Amen.
Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu, Be'eliyachu anovi avdecha, U'malchut Beit David Mishichecha, b'mheira yavo v'yogel libeinu, Al kiso lo yeshev zor, V'lo yinchalu od acherim et kivodo, Ki v'shem kotrecha nishbata lo, Shelo yichbe neiro le'olam vo'ed, Baruch ato Adonai, Mogen David.
Amen.
Al HaTorah, V'al Havodah, V'al Hanvi'im, V'al Yom HaShabbat Hazeh, Shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu, L'Kdusha V'Limnucha, L'Chavod U'Tiforet, Al HaKol Adonai Eloheinu, Anachnu Modim Lach, U'Morachim Otach, Yiporach Shimcha, B'fi Kol Hai Tamid Le'olam Vo'ed, Baruch ato Adonai, Mekahadesh HaShabbat.
Amen. Yasher Koach to Bernie Ackerman for chanting the second longest Haftarah of the year. Yasher Koach.
Thank you.
Now, like the Torah portion, the Haftarah also just has some very interesting liturgical notes on it. That very last verse that he chanted should be very familiar. It says, Migdol Yeshuot Malko V'osa Chesed Limshicho LeDavid Ulzaro Ad Olam. We're used to singing it, but who knows where that verse is from? Aaron. Right, all the way at the end at Berkat Hamazon, we recite this verse. And if you look in the Chumash, you'll see it's written in two ways. Little word says Magdiel, and the bigger one with the vowel says Migdol. And this is an example of what is called a Kri and a Ketiv. The difference between some words are written a certain way in Torah scrolls or in ancient manuscripts, but are read differently. There's a tradition of pronouncing them differently, either because the scrolls have mistakes that crept into them, or because traditions developed in other ways. And this is an example. It's written, if you were to look at an ancient manuscript, it'd be written as Magdiel, but it was always chanted as Migdol. And in Berkat Hamazon, as Aaron said, we preserve both of those by saying Magdiel on weekdays and Migdol on Shabbat. Those are the types of things I find very interesting. We turn back to the Sidurim, to page 177, the middle of the page. Please rise. I invite you to join with me in a prayer for our country, the United States of America. Our God and God of our ancestors, with mercy accept our prayer on behalf of our country and its government. Pour out your blessing upon this land, upon its inhabitants, upon its leaders, its judges, officers, and officials, who faithfully devote themselves to the needs of the public. Help them understand the rules of justice you have decreed, so that peace and security, happiness and freedom will never depart from our land. Adonai, God, whose spirit is in all creatures, we pray that your spirit be awakened within all the inhabitants of our land. Uproot from our hearts hatred and malice, jealousy and strife. Plant love and companionship, peace and friendship among the many peoples and faiths who dwell in our nation. Grant us the knowledge to judge justly, the wisdom to act with compassion, and the understanding and courage to root out poverty from our land. May it be your will that our land be a blessing to all who dwell on earth, and may you cause all peoples to dwell in friendship and freedom. Speedily fulfill the vision of your prophets. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more, for all of them, from the least of them to the greatest, shall know me, and let us say, Amen. Page 178, prayer for the state of Israel. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzor Yisrael v'goalo, Barech Medinat Yisrael, Shetehei Reshit Smichat Gulatenu. Hagen Aleha be'evrat chastecha, Ufros Aleha Sukat Shlomecha, Ushlach Orcha v'amitcha l'rosheha sareha v'yoatzeha, Taknem be'itzah tova milfanecha, Chazek yedei meginei eretz chodshenu, V'anchilem Eloheinu Yeshua, V'ateret nitzachon te'aterem, V'natata shalom ba'aretz, V'simchat olam liyoshveha, V'nomar Amen. You may be seated, page 181. Cantor leads us in the Ashrei.
Ashrei Ashrei Veitecha Od Yehallelu Chaselam.
Ashrei ha'am shekacha lo, Ashrei ha'am sh'Adonai Elohav.
Tehillah leDavid arumimcha Elohai HaMelech, v'avarcha shimcha le'olam va'ed.
B'chol yom avarcheka, v'alala shimcha le'olam va'ed.
Gadol Adonai u'mulal me'od, b'ligdulato ein cheker.
Dor ledor yishabach ma'asecha, gvurotecha yagidu.
Hadar kavod hodecha, v'divrei niflotecha asicha.
Be'ezuz norotecha yomeru, gdularcha asaprena.
Zecher rav tuvcha yabiu, v'titkatcha yiraninu.
Chanun v'rachum Adonai, erech apayim ugdal chased.
Tov Adonai lakov, v'rachamav al kol ma'asav.
Yoducha Adonai kol ma'asecha, v'chasidecha yevarchucha.
Kevod malchutcha yomeru, gvuratcha yedaberu.
Lo dia livnei adam gvurotav, v'kvod adar malchuto.
Malchutcha malchut kol olamim, u'memshaltecha b'chol dor v'ador.
Somech Adonai l'chol hanoflim, v'zokef l'chol ha'kefufim.
Einei chol elecha yisaberu, ve'ata noten lahem et ochlam beito.
Poteach et yadecha, maspil l'chol chayratzon.
Tzadik Adonai b'chol drachav, v'chasid b'chol ma'asav.
Karov Adonai l'chol korav, l'chol asher yikra'uhu be'emet.
Retzon yereav yaseh, v'yet shavatam yishma v'yoshiyeh.
Shomer Adonai kol oavav, v'yeh kol risha'im yashmi.
Tehillat Adonai yedaber pi, v'yivarech kol basar shem kodsho le'olam va'ed. V'anachnu nevarech ya, me'ata v'yad olam, hallelujah.
Page 183, we rise for the conclusion of the Torah service.
Yehallelu et Shem Adonai, ki nizkov shemo levado. Hodo al eretz v'shamayim, vayarem keren li'amo. Tehillah lechol chasidav, Livnei Yisrael, Am Kerovo. Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Mizmor leDavid, Havul Adonai b'nei Elim, Havul Adonai kavod va'oz, Havul Adonai kevod shemo, Ishtachavu Adonai
בהדרת קודש.
כל אדוני על המים אל הכבוד הרים, אדוני על מים רבים. כל אדוני בכוח, כל אדוני בהדר. כל אדוני שובר ארזים, וישבר אדוני את ארזי הלבנון. וירקידים כמו עגל לבנון בסריון, כמו בנרמים. כל אדוני חוצב לבות אש, כל אדוני יחיל מדבר, יחיל אדוני מדבר קדש. כל אדוני יחולל עיילות. ויחס עוף יערות ובהיכלו, כולו מרכבות. אדוני למבול ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם. אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. ובנוחו יאמר. כי לקח טוב נתתי לכם, תורתי אל תעזובו. עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה, ותומכיה מיושר דרכיה, דרכי נועם בכל נתיבותיה שלום. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, קדש ימינו כקדם.
We continue the bottom of page 184. Cantor, want to do another Hineni?
Not really.
No. This Musaf doesn't need a Hineni.
Yeah, I have my internal hineni
You have your eternal Hineni ready. Your internal Hineni.
Yeah.
Bottom of page 184.
We could do, actually, interesting that you should say it. I mean, so Adonai Sfatai Tiftachu Fi Yagid Hilatecha is kind of a shortened version. Adonai, open my lips that my mouth may speak your praise. We do in the Hebrew school, Adonai, Adonai, Sifatai Tiftach, Sifatai Tiftach. I know you were joking, but I always take the
Take an opportunity to teach. Could introduce that melody next time. Let's do Chatzi Kaddish, then we'll do that melody.
Okay, that sounds perfect.
We can all do our Hineni.
Vitkadash Merabah.
Amen.
Be'alma tivirach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayei chon v'yamechon v'chayei beit Yisrael b'gala u'bizman kariv yimru Amen. Yehi Shmerabah mevorach le'olam u'olam me'omaya Yitbarach Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipar v'yitroman v'yinaseh v'yitazar v'yitzav shmeri kudsha Richu li'ela min kol birchata v'shirata Tishbachata v'nachmata tamiran be'alma v'imeru Amen.
Page 185, we prepare ourselves to pray, and then we pray.
Adonai, Adonai, Sifatai Tiftach, Sifatai Tiftach, Ufi Yagid, Tehilatecha, Tehilatecha, Adonai, Adonai, Sifatai Tiftach, Ufi Yagid, Tehilatecha, Tehilatecha. And then we continue. Ay, 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 Adonai. Ay, 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 Sifatai Tiftach. Ay, 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 Ufi Yagid. Ufi Yagid Tehilatecha. Now we're ready. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, גומל חסדים טובים, וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות ואימהות, ומביא גואל לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ופוקד ומושיע ומגן. Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham, Ufoked Sarah. Atah gibor leolam Adonai, Mechayei metim atah rav leoshia, Morid hatal, Mechakel chayim bechesed,
Mechayei metim berachamim rabim.
תומך נופלים ורופא חולים ומתיר אסורים ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומי דומה לך מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה ונאמנת על החיות מתים ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים נריצך ונקדישך כסוד שיח שרפי קודש נריצך ונקדישך כסוד שיח שרפי קודש המקדישים שמך בקודש ככתוב על יד נביאך וכרזר זה ואמר קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוך כל הארץ כבודו כבודו מלא עולם משור טוב שואלים זה לזה איה מקום כבודו נאומתם ברוך יאמרו ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו הוא יפן ברחמים ויחונם המייחדים שמו ערב הבוקר בכל יום תמיד פעמיים באהבה שמע אומרים שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד הוא אלוהינו הוא אבינו הוא מלכנו הוא מושיענו והוא ישמיענו ברחמיו שנית ברחמיו שנית לעיני כל חי, והוא ישמיענו ברחמיו שנית, ברחמיו שנית לעיני כל חי, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור, ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהי ציון לדור ודור, הללויה. לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש, ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד, ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש, קדושתך נקדיש. ושבחך אלוהינו יגמר שעולם ועד, כי אל מלך גדול וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. May the words of my mouth be acceptable to you. May the path I create, may the actions I take, may it be in line with your divine glory. Yehu leratzon, imrefi, v'hegion libi lefanecha. Adonai Tzuri V'Goali, my rock and my redeemer. May the words of my mouth be acceptable to you. May the path that I take, may the actions I make be in line with your divine glory.
Cantor, related to that discussion of preparing to pray, there's this old story about Cantor and the rabbi getting ready for the high holidays in the sanctuary, and it's the day before Rosh Hashanah, and they're going over the music, and they're going through the sermon, this heavy material, and the Cantor is just, the stress is building, and the Cantor just knows this is a big deal, and she falls on her face in front of the ark and says, I'm not worthy of doing this. And the rabbi is overcome by the same feeling, just presenting the message is too much, and he falls on his face and says, God, I'm not worthy. And in the back of the room, the maintenance guy is setting up, and he doesn't understand what's going on, but he realizes this is a powerful moment for them, and he's just moved, and he falls on his face and says, I'm not worthy of doing this. And on the floor, the rabbi turns to the Cantor and says, look who thinks he's not worthy. I said, I'm here all day. Page 203, Kaddish Shalem.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ועמד יברח חירותי ומלכותי בחייכון ובמכון ובחי תחו בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך, לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה, יברך, יברך, וישבח ויבר ויתרומם וינשא ויתזר ויצלח ויצלח שמי קודשה בריחו, לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה ושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. תתקבל סלטון ובלטון תוכה ישראל קודם, אבוהון וישמעי ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום הרב מן שמעי וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן.
Amen. Page 205, we rise for Aleinu.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוצר הארץ, ומשה ביקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגבי מרומים. הוא אלוהינו אין עוד, אמת מלכנו אפס ומטו, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעת היום והשבות אל לבבך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל, והארץ מתחתינו. נגן לקבל חנוני לירום מערבית בארץ החלום. הכתוב בתורתך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
You may be seated. This Shabbat we mark the yortzites of Cindy Michelle Roth, Zachary Albert Powell, Lily Bruck, Esther Phillips, Carl Spector, Raphael Kapustin, Francine Mandel, Morris Dixon, Samuel Sobel, Leonard Schlesinger, Milton Peck, Florence Katzen, Bernie Berkman, Herbert Merrow, Florence Edgerly, Judy Glassman, Myra Nalabatsky, Francis Oster, Mary Ann Levinson, Harry Wasserman, Laura Feingold, Harriet Friedman, Edward Karp, Saul Landau, Ira Maddens, Robert Bamford, Benjamin Ellis, Adolph Lilling, Shirley Glazer, Nate Cohen, Jerome Paul, Minnie Robkoff, Minnie Ziegelheim, Mark Goodman, Oscar Deere, and Celia Mandel. We also extend condolences to Joel Ostrow for the passing of Sandra Harold, to Barry Perlmutter for the passing of his father, Jack Perlmutter, earlier this week. Turn to page 207, and I invite those in mourning or marking a yortzeit to rise and join me in the words of the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, Bialmad yivera kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala ubizman kariv v'imru amen, Yehi shemei Rabbah mevorach leolam olamei omaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei, V'yitadar, v'yit'aleh, v'yithalal, shemei dekudsha, brihu, le'ela minko berchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechamata, damiran v'alma v'yimru, amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru, amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom, Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru, amen. May be seated. I'm happy to call on our President, Teresa Brenner.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom, Temple Israel family. Welcome to all our congregants and guests. Thank you, Rabbi and Cantor Lissick, for leading us in services. Bernie Ackerman for reading Torah and chanting Haftorah. Steve Powell and Barney Weinstock for being the Gabbai, and Sean Seifert for his audiovisual support. Rabbi Walk will host a Lunch and Learn this week on Thursday, September 23rd at noon in person in the Sukkah. Advance registration is not required unless you would like a provided boxed lunch. Come join Men's Club tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning to help build the Sukkah. Bring a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. Coffee and bagels will be provided. Questions to Josh Lowensteiner. Erev Sukkot will be on Monday, September 20th at 7:30 p.m. exclusively over Zoom. And Rabbi reminded me, one of the general rules is evening services, for the most part, except for Friday night, are over Zoom or virtual, and morning services are in person and live stream. Sukkot Day 1 will be observed on Tuesday, September 21st at 9:30 in the morning in person in the main sanctuary and also on live stream. And Sukkot Day 2 on Wednesday, September 22nd will also begin at 9:30, again in person in the main sanctuary and on live stream. On Wednesday, September 22nd, Wodi will host in the evening games in the Sukkah. On Thursday, September 23rd, Social Club will host a Zoom-only program in the Sukkah with Kathleen Purvis, a nationally known food journalist and longtime Observer editor. On Friday, September 24th, the temple will host a Southern Fried Sukkot following services. And on Saturday, a week from today, Torah on Tap will host the Righteous Seven in the Sukkah. And on Sunday, a week from tomorrow, Men's Club will host steak, cigars, and scotch in the Sukkah. All these programs require advance registration, but also please check our website under upcoming programs as circumstances, including the weather, change quickly. If you ordered a lulav and etrog, please check your email box for a note from Catherine Labate for pickup instructions. You may pick up your lulav and etrog at the synagogue office on Monday until 1 p.m. We are looking forward with great excitement to the official installation of Rabbi Michael Walk as our 21st senior rabbi during Shabbat services the weekend of October 1st and 2nd. Invitations have been mailed to our home. Please select your sponsorship level online when you RSVP for pre-Oneg and Kiddush festivities. We appreciate you taking your prayer books to the lobby area when you leave. If you borrowed a Moxer for the High Holy Days, please return it to the office in the next several weeks when we are not observing a holiday. And join us after services for a Shabbat treat sponsored by Temple Israel outside in the portico. We offer many opportunities for services, learning, community, and friendship. Please join us. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom. So we thank Bernie and Terry for sponsoring the Shabbat treat this morning in honor of Bernie's bar mitzvah anniversary number 57.
Sorry, I didn't get the message. Thank you very much. That's even better.
And just one note to clarify something as we've taken those halting steps back to doing more in person. And so, as with everything, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That seems to be the way things are right now. But as of tomorrow, we're resuming in-person minions for our morning minions, which are Sunday at 9 o'clock and Thursday at 8 o'clock in the chapel. We will have Zoom open, but really encourage people, if you come to Minyan, to come in person for those services. And a week from Monday, Hoshana Rabbah, the most important holiday you have never heard of, probably, will be observed with a special minyan on Monday morning in the chapel at 7:30 a.m. I actually think it's really a beautiful service with a lot of distinct qualities that we hear once a year, but it's our last day with the lulav and etrog, and it's the time when we take the willow branches and beat them up against the wall, getting rid of our sins one last time. So if you are available on Sunday, on Thursday, or following or next Monday, please join us in the chapel. It's always a pleasure to use that room, which hasn't gotten a lot of use in the last 18 months. We continue with Ein Keloheinu on page 204. Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadonenu, Michemalkeinu, Michemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Shektiru, Avoteinu, Lefanecha et Ketoret Hasamim. 2:11.
Aleinu l'shabeach
Adon
Adon
Olam.
HaKol. Oh, we did that already.
Adon Olam.
Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, Li'et Nasa, V'chefto Kol, Azai Melech Shemo Nikra Adon Olam, V'acharei Kichlot HaKol, Levado Yimloch Nara Adon Olam, V'hu Haya, V'hu Hoveh, Adon Olam, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, Li'et Nasa, V'chefto Kol, Azai Melech Shemo Nikra Adon Olam, B'yado Afkid Ruchi, B'tishan B'yayir Adon Olam, B'imruchi Geviati, Adonai li v'Elohir Adon Olam.
Please rise for Kiddush. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Beini u'bein b'nei Yisrael, oti le'olam, oti le'olam, oti le'olam. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et ha-shamayim v'et ha'aretz. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. V'yom ha-shvi'i Shabbat v'yinafash, Shabbat v'yinafash, Shabbat v'yinafash. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Al Kain Berach, Anayam Shabbat Vayikadeshehu, Savrim, Aranan, Rabbanan, Rabotai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen.
Amen. L'chaim.
Chaim. Hold on, we'll come back to that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz.
Amen.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.